I met a woman outside a polling station in Rome last Sunday who seemed to be vibrating with a sense of purpose. She was proudly showing off her no vote to a friend, her face flushed with the kind of adrenaline you usually see at a title fight. "We stopped them," she told me, her voice thick with a triumphant, almost protective edge. To her, that ballot wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a shield she had used to save the Republic from what she called a looming disaster. But then I asked her a simple question. What did she think about the proposal to select members of the Superior Magistracy by sortition? The transition was instantaneous. The fervor vanished, replaced by a blank, slightly irritated stare. She admitted, without a hint of irony, that she had no idea what the CSM even stood for, let alone what separation of careers meant for a prosecutor. "It doesn't matter," she shrugged, her tone turning dismissive. "I don't trust the government, I don't trust the judges, I just wanted to say no." That moment, the gulf between her intense passion and her total lack of functional understanding, is the story of Italy's 2026 justice referendum. We saw a turnout that defied every cynical prediction. A massive 59% of the country showing up to decide the most complex institutional restructuring in decades. On the surface, it looked like a vibrant display of democratic health. But as I spent the following days talking to dozens of voters, a chilling pattern emerged. 8 out of 10 people I interviewed could not explain a single technical provision of the reform they had just killed or supported. They weren't voting on the judiciary. They were voting on tribal loyalties, media-fed anxieties, and personal grudges. It left me wondering if we were witnessing a new, hollowed-out form of democracy. A system where the ballot boxes are overflowing, but the civic understanding behind them has become a complete and total void.
Right. It's a really stark image.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because, we're looking at a constitutional referendum that drew over 28 million Italian voters to the polls.
Yeah, a massive turnout. Yeah.
And the result was, a definitive 53.2% victory for the no campaign. So millions of people literally carved time out of their weekend to vote on what is essentially a highly technical, specialized piece of institutional architecture.
Right, the Nordio reform.
Exactly, named after Justice Minister Carlo Nordio. And if you read the actual text of what was proposed, the stated objective was to fundamentally alter the Italian constitution by permanently separating the career paths of judges and public prosecutors.
Which is a huge deal in the Italian legal system.
This meant entirely dismantling the unified CSM, the Consiglio Superiore della Magistratura. This organization serves as the supreme self-governing body of the entire Italian judiciary.
Right, they handle everything from hiring to firing.
And the plan was to take this unified body and just split it in two. You'd have a judicial CSM exclusively for judges and a prosecutorial CSM exclusively for public prosecutors, plus a brand new high disciplinary court to handle infractions.
Yeah.
And perhaps the most radical element, the part that genuinely shook the legal establishment, was how they proposed changing the selection of members for these new bodies. The reform sought to move away from judges and prosecutors electing their peers and replace it with a system of sortition, which is, a formal way of saying they wanted to start drawing names out of a hat.
Right. And the architecture of this reform really touched upon the very foundations of the separation of powers in Italy. To truly understand the gravity of what was being proposed, and why it generated such intense friction within the legal community, we must step back and analyze the legitimate, highly technical arguments advanced by both sides of the debate.
Because there were actual substantive arguments buried under all the noise.
Absolutely. The rationale for the Yes campaign was deeply rooted in the historical evolution of the Italian legal system. We have to look back to a pivotal moment in 1988.
Okay, what happened in 88?
In 1988, Italy underwent a seismic legal shift, transitioning from a traditionally inquisitorial legal system to a more adversarial or accusatorial system.
Let me stop you right there, because those terms get thrown around in legal dramas all the time, but they represent a massive difference in how justice actually works in a courtroom. Can you break down the practical difference between an inquisitorial system and an adversarial one for someone who isn't a constitutional lawyer?
Of course. Think of an inquisitorial system as a process where the court, the part of the court, is actively involved in investigating the facts of the case.
Like they're doing the digging themselves.
Exactly. The judge is not just a passive referee. The judge is fundamentally an investigator. They're directing inquiries, questioning witnesses, and actively trying to uncover the truth. The prosecution and the judge are often seen as working in tandem toward that truth.
Okay. And the adversarial system.
Right. Contrast that with an adversarial system, which is what is used in the United States, the UK, and what Italy moved toward in 1988. In an adversarial system, the judge must act as an absolutely neutral third party.
Right.
Yes. The judge sits back and presides over a contest, a battle of evidence and argument between two strictly equal parties, the defense on one side and the prosecution on the other. The judge's job is not to investigate, but to ensure the rules of the contest are followed and to make a final determination based solely on what those two sides present.
So it's basically the difference between the judge being the lead detective versus the judge being the referee of a boxing match.
And that brings us to the core argument of the Yes campaign. The proponents of the Nordio reform argued that maintaining a unified career path where a prosecutor and a judge share the exact same governing body, the same professional trajectory, the same evaluations.
Wait, they even switch roles, right?
Yes. They can even switch roles and transfer between being a judge and a prosecutor throughout their careers. Proponents argued that this creates insurmountable structural incentives for collegial solidarity. Imagine you are a defense attorney walking into a courtroom. You look up at the bench, and you know that the supposedly neutral judge deciding your client's fate was, just a few years ago, working in the very same prosecutor's office as the person trying to convict your client.
Wow. Yeah, that would be intimidating.
Or you know that the prosecutor and the judge both belong to the same internal political faction within the CSM, and they vote for each other's promotions. Proximity, the shared culture, the shared coffee machine in the courthouse,
Right, they're colleagues.
Exactly. Proponents argued that this inherent closeness compromises the absolute adversarial impartiality required by the 1988 Code. If the judge and the prosecutor wear the same robes and answer to the same boss, the defense is at an inherent disadvantage.
If you want a fair boxing match, you don't want the referee and the opponent going out for drinks together after the weigh-in, and you certainly don't want the referee to have the power to promote the opponent's career.
Exactly.
It sounds like a logical modernization. So how did the No campaign counter that? What is the defense for keeping them locked together in the same career path?
Well, the rationale for the No campaign centered on the highly specific constitutional duties and the foundational culture of the Italian public prosecutor. You see, under Article 358 of the Italian Code of Criminal Procedure, a prosecutor in Italy is not merely an advocate for the state whose sole metric of success is securing a conviction.
Which is how we often think of prosecutors, right?
Yeah.
Just trying to win the case.
Right. But in Italy, under the law, they are actually required to seek the judicial truth. Crucially, this means they have a positive legal obligation to actively search for and present exculpatory evidence that proves the innocence of the accused.
Really? The prosecution has to actively try to prove the defendant innocent.
If they find the evidence, they must present it. They are ministers of justice, not just state advocates. So critics of the reform argued that separating the careers would fundamentally destroy this unique, balanced culture.
Because right now, the prosecutor is steeped in the mindset of a judge, even when they're building a case against someone.
Exactly. The No camp argued that by severing prosecutors from the overarching culture of judging, the reform risked turning them into what they called super policemen.
Ah, super policemen.
Right. If a prosecutor no longer views themselves as a magistrate of justice, but solely as a law enforcement official tasked with locking people up, you drastically alter the balance of state power. Furthermore, there was a deep concern regarding independence.
So,
by cutting prosecutors out of the protective herd of the broader judicial CSM, critics warned that the new, smaller prosecutorial CSM would be weaker and inevitably drawn closer to the influence of the executive branch.
right.
There is a historical fear in Europe of prosecutors becoming direct political weapons controlled by the Ministry of Justice.
Okay, but what about the sortition aspect? If the overarching goal of the reform was to depoliticize the courts and break up the internal factions, the so-called currents within the magistracy that function almost like political parties for judges and have been the subject of numerous corruption scandals, wouldn't drawing lots be the ultimate neutralizer?
It would certainly disrupt things.
Right. Sortition removes the campaign process, the coalition building, the backroom deals, and the political maneuvering entirely. I mean, you can't bribe or intimidate a random lottery.
That is precisely the mechanism the government intended to leverage. They wanted to drop a bomb on the internal factionalism of the CSM. However, the counter-argument mounted by constitutional scholars and jurists was multifaceted and incredibly fierce.
Imagine.
First, they pointed out a glaring comparative anomaly. No other modern democratic country utilizes sortition for the selection of its highest judicial governing body.
Right. It's pretty out there.
We are talking about the body that handles hiring, firing, promotions, and disciplinary actions for every judge in the country. To hand that over to random chance was viewed by many as reckless. More profoundly, it was viewed as a direct, almost insulting assault on democratic principles.
Wait, drawing lots? Like literally pulling names out of a hat for the highest judicial governing body in a G7 nation?
Really.
That sounds like something out of ancient Athens, not a modern European democracy. How did the legal community react to that specifically?
The reaction was visceral. Critics framed sortition as a genuine humiliation of the democratic rules regarding active and passive suffrage.
Let's translate that for a second. Active and passive suffrage? You mean the basic democratic right to cast a vote for someone and the fundamental right to stand for election yourself?
Yes. The right to choose your representatives and the right to offer yourself as a representative. Even organizations like the Union of the Italian Criminal Chambers, which is comprised of defense attorneys who generally supported the separation of careers in principle because it benefits the defense.
Because of the whole referee boxer dynamic.
Exactly. Even they had previously expressed deep fundamental reservations about sortition. They viewed it as an abdication of professional responsibility and a violation of the constitutional rights of magistrates to participate in their own self-governance.
So they felt like it was throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
The prevailing argument was that you do not cure the politicization of an elected body by simply throwing your hands up, stripping away the right to vote, and leaving it to a bingo machine. You cure it through better institutional design, stricter transparency, and accountability.
When you look at the architecture of this reform, it becomes immediately apparent that this was a deeply complex, highly specialized institutional redesign. It involved nuanced debates about the 1988 Criminal Procedure Code, the exact nature of prosecutorial independence, the psychological effects of career proximity, and the philosophical merits of sortition versus elected representation.
It's incredibly dense material.
Right. If you asked a panel of constitutional law professors to debate this, it would take weeks to unpack the implications. Yet this intricate, delicate constitutional surgery was placed before the general public. It was masquerading as a simple, binary yes or no question on a ballot.
And that's where the disconnect happens.
And despite these profound constitutional stakes that we just outlined, the electorate entirely bypassed this technical debate. To understand the chasm between the incredibly dense ballot text and the voters' actual lived reality, consider Pietro. Pietro is a 30-something freelance graphic designer. On the Sunday of the referendum, he is sitting in a humid Roman bar. The air is thick, the espresso machine is hissing, and above him a muted television screen shows Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini at a book signing in Budapest.
Okay, painting a picture here.
Along the bottom of that screen, the ticker tape scrolls through the dry, technical complexities we just discussed. The separation of careers, the dismantling of the unified CSM, the introduction of sortition. Pietro watches this scroll across the screen, and he feels a sharp, localized twitch of shame in his chest. He does not know what the reform actually means. If you put a microphone in his face, he could not tell you the functional difference between the judicial CSM and the prosecutorial CSM.
Most people couldn't.
Right. But what he does know, with absolute certainty, is that he hates the way the Minister of Tourism smiled during a recent parliamentary corruption hearing. He remembers the arrogance in that smile, the feeling of being talked down to by the political class while his rent goes up and his freelance invoices go unpaid.
The ocean.
When Pietro eventually leaves the bar, walks down the cobblestone street, and steps into the voting booth, his hand does not move to check a box because of a considered intellectual legal conviction regarding the adversarial justice system. His hand moves because of a visceral, itchy need to punish a face he sees too often on his phone.
Ow.
He votes no, not to protect the independence of the Italian judiciary, but to scream into a void that has stopped listening to him. He leaves the polling station with a bitter, hollow sense of winning against a ghost.
What's fascinating here is how Pietro's experience perfectly illustrates a well-documented psychological mechanism known as attribute substitution.
Attribute substitution.
Yes. This is a foundational concept in behavioral economics and cognitive psychology. When an individual is confronted with a cognitively complex question that requires a high degree of effort, historical context, and specialized knowledge to answer.
Like, should we constitutionally separate the Consiglio Superiore della Magistratura and implement sortition?
Exactly. When faced with that, the human brain frequently balks. It recognizes that it lacks the data and the processing power to formulate a rational answer. So, subconsciously, the brain replaces the impossibly hard question with a highly accessible, much simpler question.
It's like when you're staring at a massive, incomprehensible wine list at a fancy restaurant. Instead of actually evaluating the tannins, the terroir, and the vintage conditions of a 2015 Barolo, which takes way too much specialized brain power and knowledge, you subconsciously substitute it with an easier functional question. Which of these is the second cheapest?
Yes.
You make a decision based on the substitute question, but you tell yourself you made a considered choice.
You are utilizing a cognitive shortcut or a heuristic to navigate an environment where you are out of your depth. In the context of the 2026 referendum, the complex constitutional question was almost universally substituted with a highly effective, emotionally charged question. Do I approve of the Maloney government right now?
And that's a question everyone has an answer to.
Extensive academic findings confirm this exact behavior in the context of referendums. When researchers track voter behavior, utilizing large-scale panel survey data over multiple election cycles, a stark pattern emerges. Voting in this constitutional referendum functioned almost entirely as a second-order election.
Second-order election. Okay, what's a first-order election then?
A first-order election is when you vote to choose your leaders, like a general parliamentary election. The stakes are direct. A second-order election is essentially a midterm or referendum where the stakes feel lower or more abstract, and voters use the opportunity not to decide the issue at hand, but to send a message to the people in power.
Right, it's a protest vote.
Exactly. The data demonstrates that a voter's approval of the government and their generalized opinions of specific political leaders strongly correlate with their yes or no vote, consistently superseding any actual assessment of the policy being proposed. Voters utilize their stance on the current administration as a heuristic to navigate a ballot that might as well be written in ancient Greek.
You can see this happen all the time. The no vote simply became a proxy for anti-government sentiment. It was an accessible mechanism for voters to register their dissatisfaction with the incumbent coalition's handling of inflation, their stance on social issues, their foreign policy, or simply their general aesthetic political posture.
Yeah, everything gets bundled into that one no.
If you were mad about the cost of groceries, you voted no on separating the careers of judges. It makes no logical sense, but it makes perfect emotional sense.
Yes.
Conversely, the yes vote became a pure test of loyalty to the incumbent center-right coalition. If you liked the prime minister, you voted yes on sortition.
Right.
By substituting the actual constitutional question with a snap poll on the government's popularity, the entire democratic function of the referendum is completely hollowed out. The system successfully aggregates millions of individual votes, but it completely fails to aggregate any actual public deliberation on the future of the judiciary.
It's a complete short circuit of the democratic process.
Interesting. Pietro's visceral anger, his instinct to substitute the question, didn't just emerge spontaneously from a vacuum. It was actively cultivated. To understand how this substitution occurs on a mass scale, we have to look at the media ecosystem that feeds it, waters it, and profits from it. Consider Elena.
Okay.
Elena is a secondary school teacher in Milan. On the Sunday evening before the vote, Elena tries to do what we are all told a good citizen should do. She tries to inform herself. She sits down at her kitchen table and attempts to cross-reference the actual dense legal text of the referendum with analysis from 3 different news applications on her tablet.
Sounds exhausting already.
By 11 p.m., her living room is a mess of half-drunk espresso cups, notebooks, and dozens of open browser tabs. She's bathed in the blue light of the screen, rubbing her temples, and she finds herself crying. But she isn't crying out of sadness. She is crying out of the sheer bone-deep physical exhaustion of being lied to from every possible direction. One news channel she watches frames the reform explicitly as a fascist power grab, a dark plot designed to subjugate the independent courts to the will of an authoritarian executive.
Right, apocalyptic framing.
Exactly. Another channel on a different app frames the exact same reform as the only possible way to end the reign of the tocheros, the so-called red robes, and their alleged decades-long judicial tyranny over conservative politicians. Elena feels mentally colonized by these aggressive, performative talk shows where people just scream over each other.
It's a barrage of noise.
She is someone whose entire profession, her life's calling, is to educate and enlighten young minds. Yet when she steps into the voting booth the next morning, she feels like a child lost in a blizzard. The noise is so overwhelming that she cannot find true north. Ultimately, she takes her pencil and she leaves her ballot blank.
Breaking.
It is a quiet, desperate surrender to a system that has made the cognitive and emotional cost of being an informed citizen simply too high to pay.
Alina's exhaustion highlights the severe structural causes of this civic illiteracy. The Italian media ecosystem, particularly during highly polarized political campaigns, operates almost exclusively on a performative, affective register.
Affective, meaning driven by emotion.
Yes. It means the political parties do not primarily seek to explain the mechanics of their policies. They seek to signal their tribal affiliations. They are not trying to educate, they are trying to activate.
Activation over education.
Exactly. The media, in turn, does not exist to objectively inform the public. It exists to frame the narrative in a way that elicits maximum emotional resonance, because emotion drives engagement, and engagement drives revenue. This creates an incredibly toxic environment where sensationalism entirely crowds out any space for substantive, nuanced analysis.
Let's dig into that sensationalism, because to someone outside of Italy, terms like toferos or red robes might just sound like colorful political slang.
Right, it sounds almost theatrical.
But there's a deep, unresolved historical trauma attached to these phrases, isn't there? Why does calling a judge a red robe immediately shut down rational debate and trigger an emotional response?
That is a crucial piece of context. The term toferos, or red robes, carries immense historical weight dating back to the early 1990s. During that period, Italy was rocked by a massive nationwide judicial investigation known as manipulate, or clean hands.
Clean hands, right.
This investigation uncovered systemic, deeply entrenched political corruption, illegal party financing, and bribery on a staggering scale. The ensuing scandals practically wiped out the entire political establishment of the First Republic. Major political parties that had ruled for decades simply collapsed under the weight of the indictments.
That's wild to think about, an entire political system just imploding.
It was unprecedented, and the magistrates who led these investigations became national heroes to some. But to the politicians who were targeted and their supporters, these magistrates were viewed as a politically motivated left-wing inquisition determined to destroy their opponents through the courts.
So they saw it as a witch hunt.
Yes. And for the next 30 years, particularly during the era of Silvio Berlusconi, the narrative that communist-sympathizing judges, the tougher-us, were abusing their power to subvert the democratic will of conservative voters became a central pillar of right-wing political identity.
Okay, so it's a loaded term.
Incredibly loaded. So when a modern politician invokes the tougher-us in 2026, they aren't making a legal argument about adversarial procedure. They are pressing a giant red button connected to 30 years of political grievance and paranoia.
Oh.
And we can look at objective, documented examples of this type of extreme sensationalism from both sides of the 2026 campaign. The effort to bypass reason and target emotion was entirely bipartisan.
Let's hear some examples.
Let's look at the no side first. During the final weeks of the campaign, there was the widespread dissemination of fake quotes attributed to Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino.
Oh, and for anyone who doesn't know, Falcone and Borsellino were not just famous judges. They are the ultimate martyrs of the Italian Republic. They were the heroic anti-mafia prosecuting magistrates who were brutally assassinated by the Sicilian mafia in 2 massive bombings in 1992. They are practically secular saints in Italy. Their faces are on murals, schools and airports are named after them.
The reverence for Falcone and Borsellino is perhaps the only unifying sentiment in Italian public life, and the No campaign cynically exploited that reverence. Quotes began circulating heavily via WhatsApp groups, Facebook pages, and social media memes, falsely claiming that Falcone and Borsellino explicitly opposed the separation of careers before their deaths. High-profile figures within the current judiciary, including the prominent Naples public prosecutor, Nicola Gratteri, repeated these misleading claims on national television.
Wait, actual prosecutors were repeating it?
Yes. It took immense effort by independent fact-checkers, historians, and journalists to dig through the archives and point out that the quotes were entirely fabricated or wildly decontextualized. In reality, there is evidence that Falcone was open to exploring the separation of careers.
Oh.
The exposure of this misinformation eventually forced major publications like Il Fatto Quotidiano to issue formal retractions. But by then, the emotional damage was done. The lie had circled the country twice before the truth could get its boots on.
Right. And what about the yes side? You said it was bipartisan.
Oh, we must be clear that the yes side engaged in equally aggressive, highly destructive, effective framing. Justice Minister Carlo Nordio, the very architect of the reform, publicly referred to the existing CSM as a paramafia system.
He called the judicial governing body a mafia.
A paramafia system. To use the word mafia to describe the governing body of the state's own judiciary is an incredibly inflammatory escalation. Furthermore, Prime Minister Maloney, speaking from a massive political rally stage, claimed the reform would permanently end miscarriages of justice, specifically invoking the highly controversial Garlasco murder case to make her point.
The Garlasco case.
It was a tragic, sensationalized murder trial that gripped the Italian tabloid media for years, filled with reversed verdicts and endless appeals.
Like a true crime obsession for the whole country.
Exactly. Invoking it had absolutely nothing to do with the constitutional mechanics of sortition or career separation. These statements were precision engineered to bypass any intellectual debate about constitutional law and tap directly into the public's raw, visceral outrage over the perceived failures, delays, and arrogance of the judicial system.
How is a voter like Elena, our teacher in Milan, sitting at her kitchen table, supposed to navigate a landscape where even the mechanisms designed to clarify the truth become part of the political warfare? Because it didn't stop with the politicians shouting at each other. During the height of the campaign, Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, removed a video posted by the prominent, widely respected Italian historian Alessandro Barbero.
Yes, that was a massive flashpoint.
In the video, Barbero criticized the reform and explained his personal reasons for voting no. The algorithmic removal of this video sparked an absolute inferno of a censorship debate. The political opposition immediately filed urgent parliamentary inquiries, screaming that big tech was colluding with the government to silence dissent.
It was chaos.
Suddenly, the independent fact-checkers themselves were dragged into the fray, accused of being partisan operatives.
The Barbero incident perfectly illustrates what happens when a society experiences the total collapse of a shared epistemic space.
Meaning a shared reality where we at least agree on the basic verifiable facts of what is happening, even if we disagree on what to do about it.
In a healthy epistemic space, we can debate the merits of a policy based on a shared understanding of its text. In the Barbero case, independent fact-checkers had reviewed his video. They noted that while Barbero's historical summary of the Italian justice system was entirely accurate, his specific technical criticisms did not align with the actual written text of the Nordio reform.
Okay, so he got some technical details wrong.
Right. However, the fact-checkers also went out of their way to clarify that Barbero's overarching assertion, his belief that the reform risked leading the country toward illiberalism or authoritarianism through the eventual political control of the magistracy, was a legitimate, subjective political opinion.
You can't fact-check an opinion on what might happen in the future.
Exactly. It was a prediction about the potential future effects of the law. It was not a strictly verifiable or falsifiable fact, and therefore, removing the video under the guise of misinformation was a massive algorithmic overreach. Meta had made a mistake.
Just a clumsy, automated moderation error?
Yes. Yet, in the hyperpolarized environment of the campaign, this crucial nuance was entirely lost. The accidental removal was instantly weaponized by the no camp as undeniable proof of an authoritarian silencing of dissent.
You can see how this toxic environment ensures that the ballot box fundamentally transforms. It is no longer a tool for collective decision-making. It becomes a Rorschach test for pre-existing political identities, rather than a shared object of deliberation. When you look at the Nordio reform, voters are not evaluating the same set of facts. They are reacting to entirely different sets of emotional stimuli, carefully designed by algorithms and campaign managers to trigger their deepest, most primal political anxiety. And as the media fog thickens, as people lose trust in what they're reading and seeing, it breeds a very specific, very dangerous type of political weapon: conspiratorial thinking. The debate over the 2026 referendum wasn't just characterized by the usual political spin or misinformation. It was defined by severe, historically loaded allegations that sound like the plot of a spy novel.
It really did get dark.
Critics of the reform relentlessly asserted that the separation of careers was not a new idea proposed by the current government, but rather an idea originally envisaged in the Democratic Rebirth Plan. Now, to understand the explosive nature of that claim, you have to know what the Democratic Rebirth Plan is.
It's a heavy historical reference.
This was a blueprint drawn up in the 1970s by a man named Licio Gelli and the subversive P2 Masonic Lodge. The P2 Lodge was not your grandfather's friendly fraternal organization. It was a shadowy, illegal, criminal organization with deep neo-fascist links.
The literal secret society.
Yes. It was implicated in various violent attempts to subvert the Italian state during the years of lead, a period of intense domestic terrorism, bombings, and political kidnappings in Italy. The P2 Lodge infiltrated the highest levels of the military, the intelligence services, the media, and parliament. Their goal was essentially an authoritarian, anti-communist takeover of the democratic institutions from the inside.
And that's the connection they made.
Exactly. And the No campaign effectively linked the 2026 Nordio reform directly to this incredibly dark, traumatic chapter of Italian history. They were essentially saying, a vote for yes is a vote to complete the fascist takeover started in the 1970s.
The proponents of the reform were forced to counter this sensationalized narrative by pointing out the actual legislative history. They argued that the separation of careers had been a mainstream, transparent political objective for decades, long after the P2 Lodge was dismantled.
Right, trying to bring it back to reality.
They pointed out that the reform was actually perfectly in line with the logic of the 1988 Code of Criminal Procedure, which, it is worth noting, was drafted by the socialist jurist Giuliano Vassalli.
Hey, who's he?
He was a decorated anti-fascist partisan during World War II. So, linking his code's logic to a neo-fascist plot is quite a stretch. They also highlighted that similar proposals to separate judicial careers had been championed by mainstream center-left coalitions in the late 1990s and again in the late 2010s.
So it wasn't just a right-wing idea?
No. The Yes campaign maintained that comparing a modern technocratic constitutional reform aimed at judicial efficiency to a subversive, neo-fascist Masonic plot was an act of pure, unadulterated fear-mongering.
It's just wild.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of voter behavior, the political consequences of this kind of conspiratorial thinking are profound. Academic analysis of recent Italian referendums demonstrates unequivocally that conspiracist ideation is socially patterned, and it is frequently deliberately weaponized during high-stakes campaigns.
How does that actually show up in the data, though?
The data clearly shows that a voter's belief in conspiracy theories drastically lowers the likelihood of them casting a yes vote on any institutional reform.
Really?
Yes, completely independent of that voter's standard partisan alignment or education level. By utilizing the narrative of an imminent authoritarian drift and linking the reform to the trauma of the P2 Lodge, the No campaign successfully activated deep-seated predispositions in voters who inherently distrust elites, who feel alienated from power, and who harbor a lingering fear of hidden agendas operating behind the scenes of the republic.
But there is a glaring contradiction here that we need to point out.
That
Usually when we think about conspiratorial thinking in modern politics, we associate it with anti-establishment, populist movements operating on the fringes, trying to tear down the system.
right, the outsiders.
Exactly. In this scenario, the dynamic was completely inverted. The government, the ultimate establishment, holding the levers of power, was proposing the reform. It was the opposition, which included the institutional defenders of the Constitution, the magistrates themselves, and the established center-left, that was utilizing these conspiratorial frameworks. They were the ones bringing up the P2 Lodge, dark powers, and shadow governments.
That role reversal is perhaps the most critical defining dynamic of this entire referendum. The government, currently holding power, attempted to present a technocratic, modernizing front. They argued they were simply updating the machinery of the state to align with European standards of efficiency.
We're just fixing the plumbing.
Exactly. The opposition, seeking to block the reform at all costs, adopted the aggressive rhetorical strategies typically associated with populist insurgencies. By framing the government's constitutional actions as a secretive, historically rooted plot to subjugate the independent judiciary and erode democratic checks and balances, the no vote was transformed in the minds of the voters into a defensive shield. Voters who might otherwise strongly support judicial efficiency and modernization were persuaded that a yes vote was not a vote for reform, but a capitulation to creeping authoritarianism. The conspiratorial framing successfully flipped the traditional dynamics of political change. It made the defense of the absolute status quo feel like a radical, heroic act of anti-establishment resistance.
If we look at the whole board, we have voter behavior entirely driven by attribute substitution, where people vote on their feelings about the prime minister rather than the Constitution.
Yes.
We have a media fog that actively prevents civic education, paralyzing voters like Elena. And we have conspiratorial thinking weaponized by the very institutional defenders tasked with upholding the rule of law. This synthesis leads us to the ultimate devastating consequence the 2026 referendum. The total collapse of institutional trust. Look at the story of Lorenzo. Lorenzo is an Italian expat in his early 40s who currently lives and works in London. He is one of the millions of Italians living abroad who retained the right to vote. But Lorenzo didn't want to mail in a ballot. He traveled all the way back from the UK to his small hometown in the Veneto region, specifically to cast his vote in person for this referendum. But when he arrives at the local registry, his name is caught in a labyrinthine bureaucratic tangle between his foreign resident status and the local electoral rolls. He finds himself sitting on a hard plastic chair in a dusty municipal office that smells distinctly of stale cigarette smoke, floor wax, and old, decaying paper.
I think we've all been in an office like that.
He watches a clerk behind a plexiglass desk shrug at his predicament with terrifying absolute indifference. The clerk tells him the computer system is down, there's nothing to be done, maybe come back tomorrow.
Classic bureaucracy.
For Lorenzo, the concept of separating the careers of judges and prosecutors wasn't just an abstract legal theory to be debated on talk shows. It was the last tether to a country he desperately wanted to believe in, a country that he hoped could modernize, cut through the red tape, and reform itself.
Right, it represented hope for change.
But as he sits there on that plastic chair, listening to a radio broadcast on his phone detailing the government's harsh physical crackdown on anti-fascist protesters in a nearby city, that tether finally snaps. He looks around the dusty office, he looks at the indifferent clerk, and he realizes that this grand constitutional reform, this delicate surgery on the separation of powers, is being handled by hands he no longer trusts to hold a pen, let alone rewrite the foundational document of the Republic.
It just becomes too much.
He gets up, he walks out of the office, and he heads back to the airport, leaving his vote uncast. He realizes, with a profound sense of grief, that the ballot box had become a mere prop in a play where the ending was already written by the loud and the corrupt.
Lorenzo's silent withdrawal from the democratic process represents the deep-seated, historically rooted distrust that defines the modern relationship between the Italian citizen and the state. It evokes a very famous, very dark concept, often referred to as the Mussolini question.
The Mussolini question.
Yes. The dictator once cynically claimed that governing Italians is not difficult, it is merely useless.
Yes.
While we must entirely categorically refute the fatalism and the authoritarianism inherent in that statement, we must also be willing to acknowledge the precise structural tension it observes. There is a massive, seemingly unbridgeable gap between the formal, theoretical architecture of democracy, the beautifully designed voting booths, the intricate parliamentary procedures, the constitutional referendum laws.
The theory of it all.
Right. The gap between that and the actual civic conditions required for that democracy to function effectively in reality.
And Lorenzo fell right into that gap.
The decisive victory of the No campaign cannot be uniformly read as a considered deliberate defense of the unified judicial corps by an informed public. For a vast segment of the electorate, it was the result of tribal loyalties, relentless media manipulation, and crucially, a highly rational adaptation to an environment of chronic institutional unreliability.
Rational adaptation. That's a strong way to frame it.
It is rational. When voters deeply, fundamentally distrust the architects of a proposed change, they default to rejecting that change, regardless of its technical merits or its potential to improve their lives.
Because if you don't trust the builder, you're not going to let them remodel your house.
If you believe the system is rigged, any proposed alteration to the rules of the game is viewed as an attempt to rig it further against you. The no vote was less a rejection of the specific legal mechanisms of the Nordio reform, and more a sweeping rejection of the political class that proposed it, driven by a profound, exhaustion-induced skepticism that any institutional alteration would ever actually benefit the everyday citizen.
The outcome is a matter of historical record. The no vote won with 53.2% of the ballots cast. The constitutional reform is dead. The Consiglio Superiore della Magistratura remains exactly as currently constituted, and the careers of Italian judges and prosecutors remain unified.
The state of democratic deliberation revealed by this process requires rigorous, unflinching assessment. A democracy that routinely produces valid electoral outcomes through fundamentally meaningless deliberation faces a slow, systemic crisis. It is the gradual, unseen erosion of the epistemic conditions necessary for true self-governance. When the electorate's choices are entirely severed from a functional understanding of the policies at stake, the formal mechanisms of democracy persist. The polls open, the ballots are counted, the winners are declared, but their substantive value degrades into pantomime. The institutional system owes the electorate a better, more transparent conversation regarding its own governance, but the overwhelming evidence of the 2026 referendum indicates that this conversation has not yet begun.